What's happening, YouTube? It's Simon466 Cards here, and today we're going to talk about local card shops, or LCSs as they're known. Before we get started, if you're new to the channel, we do a weekly video investigating either the economics, the business side, or even the data and analytics of the sports card world. With that being said, let's jump right into it. Today, I want to talk about local card shops, as mentioned earlier, and how the role they play in bringing kids into the hobby. And I want to really think through and talk about why you hear card shops, LCSs are important. And the number one thing is people saying that card shops are what brought them into LCSs, and we need them to bring kids into the hobby, right? And so whenever you hear this, you always hear about how when this person was a kid, they went with their family to the LCS to buy packs, to rip wax, and that got them hooked in the sports cards, and they've loved it ever since. But that's how it all started, right? And you hear that story a lot, and it's very common. And as a result, you'll also hear as the next logical step there is that's how kids come into the hobby. It's important to bring more people to the hobby for that next generation to keep building the hobby going forward. I agree with that. I think it's important to keep the hobby growing with kids and bringing new blood into the hobby and having new people get that excitement of opening a pack and all that kind of stuff. I agree with that 100%. But the logical leap that is made here is people saying this are saying how they entered the hobby is the best way to bring kids into the hobby in 2023. How I did it is how it must be the way or the best way that it should be done today. And that's the logical the logical leap that I don't agree with. I think that's a little bit too simplistic when you rely on your personal experience of what was done yesterday must be the way it is done today. And that's just general life lesson is we're doing it that way because that's the way it's always been is the worst reason to do something. And so let's examine that. And I think the real, issue or challenge I have with this is the sports card environment's changed, and it's no longer the 80s and 90s. And the reason why that's important is the people saying these things are inevitably people in their 30s, 40s, or even 50s who grew up with cards in the 80s and 90s when the LCS was literally the only option of how to buy sports cards, right? There was no eBay, there was no any of these other channels that we have, and so they're biased by the fact that the LCS was the way to be for me, without acknowledging the LCS was also the only way to get cards. There was no other way. That's no longer the case now, and so that's where I think they're overlooking the fact that their personal experience was biased because it's from a different era that doesn't exist today, right? And if you think about bringing kids in the hobby today, the world itself has changed. It's much more digital. It's much more online. It's, all the other things that are just obvious, right? And the hobbies followed suit, right? It's also become mostly online. You have all the different auction sites, I won't get into them, and marketplaces, but you also have different social media channels, different like Instagram, Facebook, and even things like Blowout, Discord. There's so many different ways that are not at an LCS, that are not in person. And even if you think about in-person experience, I would say the energy of a trade night or a card show is much more likely to hook a kid into loving the hobby and loving sports cards than walking into an LCS and ripping a pack. There was just a different type of excitement and energy at a trade night or card show, even if you're just observing, right? Or even if you don't make any trades or whatever, right? It's a totally different atmosphere because you're surrounded by a bunch of like-minded individuals with a passion and a love and an excitement for cards. Whereas you often hear about some of these LCS owners or people that run in these LCSs where they're kind of jerks, they're indifferent, they don't give a good customer experience. They're almost indifferent to new people in the hobby, right? And again, you hear about those type of LCS owners or management, right? Obviously, there's tons of LCSs out there that are fantastic and are energetic and embrace new people and all that kind of stuff. But I would say that even, even an in-person experience to get a kid excited, it might not be an LCS. It might be a trade night. It might be a card show. And again, there's so many other online options for bringing a kid into the hobby. And that kind of brings me to my third point, right? We've talked about the experience of people with this notion that LCS is the only way to bring a kid into the hobby, and also what kids relate to in terms of online and experiences, right? The one thing that people don't think about when they talk about how LCSs are, the lifeblood of the hobby and bringing new kids in is, well, what about the LCS itself? What about the business case for them today in 2023? I think that's really overlooked. I would love to have an LCS in every city and have one maybe even in every neighborhood or whatever, right? But is it profitable? Is it easy to be profitable? Can these survive? They need to survive. And I would say, again, these people talking about LCSs and they grew up with them and yada, 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 that's because the LCS in the 80s and 90s, they had no competition. They're literally, their competition was whatever LCS was in the city or in the neighborhood. If they didn't have another LCS in the city, they literally would have a monopoly, right? And that's not the case today. An LCS, their competition is dealers. Their competition is eBay. Their competition is Blowout. Their competition is, all these different types of marketplaces. That's just totally different. It's the competition way more intense. Why would you go into an LCS if you're a parent, right? You want to get a box for your kid, for example, right? If eBay's selling it for, I don't know, $300 and your LCS is selling it for $350, why would you ever go to the LCS, right? Other than if you're, especially in the current economy with inflation and all that kind of stuff, you would just go to the lowest cost place that you can find, right? And so the LCS competition is it's so much harder today than it was 30 years ago, 20, even 25 years ago, right? So that's like the big piece that I think people are missing when they say LCSs. Let's make sure we have LCSs. It's not that easy anymore, right? And so to survive, you can't just survive on kids opening packs on the weekend, every other weekend, every month. Like, you have to do other stuff to get that hustle, right? You have to, break, whether it's breaks, selling online on eBay, other auction sites, organizing trade nights, joining your local card show. There's so many different ways, but it's a grind, I would imagine, right? You can't just be like, okay, I'm gonna open the card store and survive on, parents bringing their kids just to open a couple packs. Like, think of how expensive wax is. Think of how expensive some of these products are. Prism, and you're also fighting with retail, with Walmart, with all those type of places. It's not the same. And I don't think you can really survive on people bringing their kids to open a couple of packs of hoops or a prism blaster or whatever it is, right? I'm just talking about NBA, but it's not the same environment. So those are my thoughts on LCSs. Again, if an LCS could survive in every neighborhood in every city, I'm all for it. I just don't think it's doing as much to bring people into the hobby or kids in the hobby as you think compared to all the different options out there. And then B, I think it's hard to run an LCS these days versus in the 80s and 90s, right? And especially think about the LCSs that might have popped up, right, in the last couple of years when things were booming in 2020, 2021. It's a different world now. We're no longer just going up and up and up. We're no longer on the moon. We're back on Earth here. And so I worry that a lot of these LCSs that might have opened in the last couple of years, they won't have enough juice to keep it going if they're not doing some of these other hustles to make sure that they basically have multiple channels of revenue. So those are my thoughts on LCSs. Feel pretty strongly about this one. I would love to hear your thoughts about whether or not LCSs are as important in terms of bringing new blood, new kids into the hobby as people think they are or want them to be. So feel free to let me know in the comments below. One thing we always do here on the channel is we do a preview of the next week's video. And so that'll be a common and really big mistake that people make selling their cards on Facebook that I've seen. So we'll talk about that next week. You can see a pretty strong hint on the screen of what it is. So we'll talk about that next week. Thank you all for watching and listening. I can be found on Instagram at Simon466cards as well. So until then, I will talk to you next week. Cheers.